History is all around us, but we don't always notice. I'm sometimes surprised how easily history can be lost even when it's in plain sight. For example, our language is chock full of hidden history. Did you know the word guy, as in the history guy, was named after an actual guy? After the failure of the 1605 gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament, people in England burned effigies of the ringleader, Guy Fawkes. Those effigies came to be known as guys and eventually became a generic term for a man.
If you are caught by the surprise in the hidden history of language, it's understandable. For example, you might have enjoyed a dessert called German chocolate cake and wondered, what part of Germany did this hail from? The answer, Texas. Priya Krishna explains in the e-magazine Taste. Nothing about its components. The light, mellow chocolate crumb, the crunchy, chewy coconut pecan frosting, the decadent layers, fits within any part of the German culinary canon. The cake got the name because it is made from a type of chocolate that around 1852 was invented by a person who worked in a Massachusetts chocolate mill named Samuel German, who wasn't even, it turns out, of German heritage. While German was from Massachusetts, the name Summer German Chocolate Cake was first published in a recipe in the May 10, 1956 edition of a local Dallas paper, the Irving News Record, submitted by a woman named Daisy Pierce. And that might not be the only surprise. The chocolate in the recipe was called German's Sweet Chocolate and was made by the Baker's Chocolate Company of Boston. As the company, still today, makes chocolate primarily for use in baking, you may have reasoned that it's called Baker's Chocolate because you bake with it. But company founder Dr. James Baker didn't apparently have that in mind when he named the company after himself. When French diplomat Jean-Nicot de Villemain, the French ambassador to Portugal, introduced a New World plant brought back by the Portuguese to the French court of Queen Catherine de' Medici in 1560, he couldn't hardly have imagined how he would be immortalized for the act. 5 years later, German botanist Adam Lontzer named the entire genus of the plant that today we call tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, and named the addictive stimulant that was the product of the plant, nicotine. The name for the genus, after a man who never visited the continent from which the plant came, stuck, as did the common name for one of the most common vices in the modern world. It's not the only name with surprising geography in its etymology. Today, macadamia nuts are strongly associated with Hawaii, a leading producer of the nut. But the nuts are actually not native to Hawaii, but to Australia. They were introduced to Hawaii in 1881, not as a commercial crop, but as a windbreak to protect sugar crops. The trees were successful enough that by 1922, Ernst Van Tassel established the Hawaiian Macadamia Nut Company. But long before it became a Hawaiian staple, the nut was a major food source for Australian Aborigines. It was first encountered by Europeans in the 19th century. In 1853, German-born botanist and physician Ferdinand von Mueller was appointed government botanist by the Victorian colonial government. And in 1855, he traveled with the North Australian Exploring Expedition. On the journey, he found and described nearly 800 species new to European science, including Macadamia ternifolia. He chose the name to honor his friend, Scottish-born physician and Australian politician John McAdam, who was not involved in either the discovery nor the description of the plant, and who, it seems, never visited Hawaii. The word mesmerize, meaning to hold the attention of someone to the exclusion of all else, seems to fit. It's almost mesmerizing in itself. But according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term comes directly from the 18th century physician Franz Mesmer. Born in Swabia in 1734, he studied medicine at the University of Vienna, and in 1766 published a doctoral dissertation on the influence of the planets on the human body. In a period where surprisingly little was known about medicine, this idea, which seems largely silly to the modern audience, could be taken seriously, and he may have plagiarized much of the content from Richard Mead, who had published a similar treatise in 1704. Mesmer's work built on Newton's theory of the tides, suggesting that the tides in the human body might be explained by the movements of heavenly bodies. Mesmer expanded on this theory about bodily tides in 1774 when he produced an artificial tide in a patient suffering from hysteria. He had her swallow a concoction with iron in it and then used magnets to attempt to affect her symptoms. According to the patient, she felt a fluid running through her body and thought it relieved some of the symptoms. Mesmer didn't seem to think the magnets were really part of the cure, instead forming a theory of animal magnetism, also known as mesmerism. He posited the existence of Lieben magnetismus, an invisible magnetic force of some kind existing in all living things, and that impacting that force could have physical effects. The theory of animal magnetism was popular and influential for about 75 years, and practitioners were known as magnetizers. Hundreds of books were written on the subject. In 1784, royal commissions appointed by French King Louis XVI, including members like Benjamin Franklin, attempted to establish the theory on scientific evidence. They determined that the effects were either from the patient's imaginations or charlatanry. His treatments included him sitting in front of a patient with his knees touching while looking fixedly into the patient's eyes, supposedly producing a trance-like state. In later years, the term mesmerism would come to be synonymous with hypnotism, and while his theories and practices are discredited, he is immortalized in the word mesmerize. Mesmer might actually be glad of his legacy, but others may very much have regretted things with which their names have become associated. During the French Revolution, the guillotine rose to prominence after a French physician named Joseph Ignace Guillotin advocated for its use. But that's only part of the story. While the machine that now bears his name has become synonymous with the brutality of the Revolution's terror, Guillotin actually was an opponent of the death penalty. He believed it was inhumane, but he decided that he would be unable to halt capital punishment and so hoped to reform it as a step towards abolition. The wealthy and high class, when sentenced to death, would usually be decapitated, considered humane compared to what lower class criminals got, like the slow death of hanging or the brutality of being beaten to death on the wheel. Guillotin saw the new device as considerably more humane and envisioned it to be equitably used regardless of class. In an appearance before the National Assembly in 1789, he argued for the guillotine to become the standard for capital punishment. "Now with my machine I take off your head in the twinkling of an eye, and you never feel it," he said. The statement became a joke, and in the days following a comic song was even written about Guillotine's machine. He did not, however, invent the machine. Beheading machines have a long history in France. In 1210, a French text described a beheading machine, writing that a hand could draw forth a pin and a cutting blade of steel drop it down. A steel sharper than any razor would behead victims. In Halifax, the British had a gibbet of similar design that may have been used as early as 1280. In 1791, the French National Assembly formed a committee under a physician to the king, Antoine Louis, who allegedly produced a prototype based on earlier designs. There was at least one other design from another committee member. For a time at least, the machine was called the Lousiette, or the Louison, after his name, but it was Guillotine's name that stuck. Guillotin was shocked in 1795 when a letter was published that suggested that victims might actually survive for a brief time after the beheading. He and his family were appalled that his legacy was so connected to something he abhorred and had become synonymous with the Reign of Terror. When he died in 1814, according to History Today magazine, his family was petitioning the government to rename the machine. When the government refused, the magazine says the family changed their name instead. While it is sometimes stated that Guillotin was killed by his own machine, in fact he died at home, his head still connected, at age 75. Another Frenchman in the same period gives us another surprising word. Etienne du Silhouette was made the Controller General of Finances under King Louis XV in 1759. A horrible time to be controlling France's finances, as the spiraling deficit and enormous costs of the 7 Years' War left the country's budget in shambles. His efforts to save money, including trying to tax the traditionally exempt nobility and church, earned him scorn. His name became synonymous with penny-pinching cheapness and austerity. It may have been merely a coincidence that at the same time the economic situation led to the popularity of an inexpensive art form, cutting shadow profiles from black paper, meant to be a cheaper alternative for those who could not afford paintings or sculpture. They became especially popular after Madame du Pompadour took a liking to the style. But how his name became specifically associated with the style is unclear. Originally, this style of portraiture was called profiles or shades. But as cheap things became called à la silhouette, one theory is that it eventually applied to the cheap portraits, and from there the concept of someone's outline against a lighter background. There are other theories of how his name became associated with the art form. An 1895 book claims the word was originally applied to everything that seemed ephemeral, referring to his brief tenure as finance controller. There is evidence that the term à la silhouette could predate his tenure as finance controller as early as 1753. The French government gazetteer in 1869 claims that one of Silhouette's pastimes was to draw a line around the shadow of a head in order to see its profile on the walls of his castle. His first mention in the French Universal Biography, however, does not mention that he made portraits himself. The name didn't become firmly attached to the shadow profile until the turn of the 19th century. Silhouette and Guillotin are not the only men who might be embarrassed about the words with which they are now associated. The term boycott, much used today, is also named after a man, but not the man who invented the concept, but instead the man who was first a victim of it. Captain Charles Boycott was the land agent of an English landowner in Ireland. In 1880, Boycott attempted to evict tenants from their land when they couldn't pay their rents due to a poor harvest during the so-called Land War of social agitation in Ireland. Irish Land League leader Charles Stewart Parnell suggested that instead of using violence, locals should punish people who took evicted tenants' land by shunning them. While Parnell did not suggest targeting the land agents or landlords, the tactic took off when they applied it to Boycott. The entire community shunned Boycott. Shops refused to serve him. He couldn't find workers for his fields, and even the postman refused to deliver his mail. He shot off a letter to the Times criticizing the actions of the League, claiming his blacksmith and laundress threatened to stop working for him. Money was raised to send loyalists to help Boycott with workers, is actually guarded by a regiment of hussars, but the letter turned out to be a mistake. The press picked up on the term, with James Redpath of the New York Tribune first using the word in the international press. By November of 1880, the Times used his name to describe organized isolation. By 1881, the word was being used figuratively, as a woman boycotted London from Kew to Mile End. Irish author George Moore said that, like a comet, the verb boycott appeared. In December, the Daily News reported that even the stoutest-hearted are yielding on every side to the dread of being boycotted. The cost of hiring and defending his crops was so great that Boycott suffered a major financial loss, and soon left Ireland in disgrace. Another dubious honor goes to Daniel Elmer Salmon, the namesake of Salmonella. Salmon, who earned the first doctorate of veterinary medicine in the United States, spent much of his career working for the Department of Agriculture, eventually establishing a veterinary division within the department. In 1885, Theobald Smith, who worked under him, isolated the Salmonella bacteria. He believed it to be the cause of hog cholera and thus called it the hog cholera bacillus. It wasn't until 1900 that Joseph John Linné, studying salmonellosis in Argentina, proposed and described the genus of bacteria, naming it after Salmon, not Smith, who had actually done the work. If you're seeing this video, there's a good chance it's because of the algorithm, presumably so named because it is a mathematical tool to design patterns or rhythms. Actually, the word is derived from a scholar and mathematician of the Islamic Golden Age, named Muhammad ibn Musab al-Khwarizmi. He wrote an influential book called Al-Jabr in the 800s, which lends its name to the term algebra. But his own name, which initially referred to the Arabic system of numerals and calculation, came to numerous languages in its Latinized form, algorithm.
If you are familiar with the porous drain that is used in landscaping, that's called a French drain, uses gravel or rock to drain water away from an area, you really couldn't be blamed for imagining that it was probably invented in France. But in fact, it's an ancient invention. It was used by the ancient Egyptians millennia before an American lawyer and agriculturalist and assistant secretary of the Treasury named Henry Flagg French popularized its use in an 1859 magazine article. There are so many other words and terms that were named after people, and for some of those, the connections have been lost, obscured by everyday use and time. And of course, new names are likely to arise as language continues to evolve, and we think up new words to refer to new things for new purposes. And as language changes, it would be good to remember that language carries history with it, if only we take the time to learn it. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.